This podcast is made possible by the listener members of Nashville Public Radio.
This is the Nashvillager Podcast. It's January 3rd, 2025. On this day in 1876, students at Fisk University gathered for the first time in a brand new building paid for by the students' own fundraising efforts. Jubilee Hall was built with money raised by the small choir that continues to perform today, the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And if you want to know more about the incredible musical tradition of that group, a Nashville Public Radio documentary from a couple of years ago is still available on our website. It's called Three Castles and the Music City, and it's a really great listen. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. The usual quick retelling of the Jubilee Singers story gets right to Fisk's need for money to build a campus, but doesn't always mention why funds were so low. Fisk, like a lot of other educational institutions created for Black people after the Civil War, depended on money from the federal government's Freedmen's Bureau. In fact, there were several other schools, colleges, and seminaries around Nashville that were also working hard to quickly educate formerly enslaved people using that funding source. It was incredibly important work. The harsh restrictions of slavery, combined with really onerous laws that severely limited even free Black people before the Civil War, meant that a massive number of now emancipated people entered the post-war job market with a huge deficit in training and education. A new integrated society simply couldn't work unless they were given a hand in catching up. But the Freedmen's Bureau was understaffed and never very well funded. It was tasked with doing just about everything Black folks needed with few resources to make that happen. And surprise, surprise, not everyone was happy to see even meager government resources put towards leveling the playing field. It was essentially an idea from President Lincoln that lacked substantial official support after his assassination. His successor, Tennessee's Andrew Johnson, tried to veto its creation and reauthorization. After just a few years of operations, the activities at the Freedmen's Bureaus were scaled back. And in 1872, less than a decade after the war's end, Congress decided not to reauthorize the Bureau at all. The funding that so many Black schools relied upon simply disappeared, and an awful lot of the schools went away, too. And that's the funding crisis that led Fisk to create the Jubilee Singers and send them around the nation and eventually around Europe, raising money by singing spirituals. It is a great story of an institution finding a way to take care of itself. But it's also a story of the rug being pulled out from under far too many people, of an attempt at fairness, equity, and evening the score being ended before it could have much impact, of how people and society as a whole can pay the price in a very real way when the political tides turn. And let's be clear, Fisk is an example of how things played out on the education front. But there are parallel stories to be told about how promises were made and then rescinded when it came to creating equity for Black folks in terms of property ownership, access to credit, political representation, all kinds of things that are intrinsic to participating in American life. There have been plenty of studies showing how the ripple effects of that time are still being felt today, still creating economic and educational speed bumps, if not full-on hurdles, for people of color. And studies also show that all too many people still exhibit certain kinds of implicit racism that was at the core of the push to end the Freedmen's Bureau, like a gut feeling that most Black folks aren't really that smart or that they can't be trusted with money, which is exactly a point that a lot of folks supporting Nashville's other historically Black university have raised again and again. They say the state government has been quick to step into criticizing and managing, or some would say micromanaging, Tennessee State University because its leaders are Black. Last year, as GOP leaders pushed to totally clear out the university's board for a fresh start, Democratic State Senator Charlene Oliver said it plainly. She said, quote, "There is a direct attack to feed the narrative that Black leaders are not capable of managing large sums of money." Since then, the board was vacated, a new one appointed, TSU's president stepped down, an interim was named, and he's already stepped down too, saying in the process that no matter what cost-cutting measures he suggested, it was never enough for the state. And now a letter is circulating from more than a dozen Democrats in the state legislature calling out the state comptroller. They're accusing Jason Mumpower of being unprofessional, aggressive, and inappropriate in the way he talked about TSU and its leaders at a meeting of the State Building Commission last month. They accuse him of going out of his way to disparage past President Glenda Glover. His words were that she, quote, made out like a bandit while leaving only a legacy of dysfunction. Mumpower also suggested the schools should sell off property for money. The letter calls that idea a recipe for destabilizing the institution. And once again, says the state needs to pony up money to make up for its chronic underfunding of TSU. Those criticisms are a pretty close echo to the complaints about the comptroller's approach to one small West Tennessee town. Mason is a majority black community, but for a long time, its leadership was white. That leadership truly bungled the way it handled money. The comptroller's office didn't step in while the problems were mounting. Mumpower waited until Ford decided to build a major factory nearby, and until black leaders took over and struggled to figure out how to clean up the mess. Mumpower also didn't give them very much time to find a fix before declaring they weren't up to the job. His criticism of Mason officials sounded an awful lot like the things he has to say about the folks leading TSU. And his solutions for Mason's problems were extreme. First, he suggested they completely hand over their town charter to the state. After some legal back and forth, even the compromise was pretty intense. Local officials technically retained control, but for any expenditure over $100, they needed sign-off from his office. Now, there's no question that TSU has money problems, and so does the town of Mason. The general approach from Comptroller Mumpower and folks like him is that the past is its own thing. The facts on the ground and the moment are all that matter, and that the numbers don't add up. But we have to keep asking certain questions. Is blame being placed on the people who are actually responsible for the books not balancing? Has the state of Tennessee really done its part, or does it have a financial debt to pay to these cash-strapped entities? And is the state operating from the same playbook when it deals with majority black groups of leaders as it does when the officials grappling with financial challenges are white? In just a few minutes, a rare glimpse inside a storied East Nashville music studio. That's coming up after the newscast.
Thematic Static on WNXP is the mixtape we make together. A themed set loosely organized by you, the listener, handpicking songs according to a theme. Airing first Thursdays at 9 a.m. and again Saturdays at 9 a.m., Thematic Static plucks your requests from the socials at WNXP Nashville and by voice memo at 615-320-9100. Thematic Static, the mixtape we make together, supported by United Record Pressing, only on WNXP.
Here's the latest from WPLN News. Just days after Tennessee announced it had a new manual for executing death row inmates, the state's top prison officials say they aren't going to release the document to the public. The Tennessee Department of Correction denied an Associated Press public records request, citing a state law that protects the identities of the executioner and the other people involved. However, the law says confidential information should be redacted, and that the confidential information itself is not a reason to deny a records request. The decision to maintain secrecy around the document is starkly different to how the state has handled similar requests in the past, but mirrors efforts across the U.S. to suppress public access to executions. Tennessee Republicans are proposing legislation in reaction to hate groups that paraded through Nashville last year. Of the crimes committed in 2023, the Tennessee Department of Investigation identified more than 120 that were motivated by bias, according to a recent report. The legislation filed yesterday by Representative William Lamberth and Mark Pody would create harsher penalties for people if they refuse to give their names to police, ride in the bed of a truck, or display anything on public roadways. That last stipulation comes after neo-Nazis tried to hang a banner over an overpass in West Nashville in the fall. The rate of new HIV cases tied to drug use in Tennessee is surging, doubling over the past few years. Experts say that makes safe syringe programs more important than ever. WPLN's health reporter Catherine Sweeney tells us more.
The latest data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from 2022 shows that 14% of new cases were among people who inject drugs. There are several factors playing into that growth, says Dr. Ima Honkai, an infectious disease specialist. Substance use disorder is a continuing problem. She says the pandemic made services harder to access while taking a toll on the country's mental health. But there's also an infrastructure problem.
Making sure we have harm reduction programs widely available for those that need them is really challenging. And where we don't have those services, we see kind of the compounding effects of that.
Only about a dozen of Tennessee's 95 counties have clean syringe programs, for example. Ahonkai says those are critical for infectious disease prevention, and that's not just HIV and hepatitis.
A lot of skin and soft tissue infections, heart valve infections, bone infections.
It's unclear what kind of federal support syringe programs will get under the new presidential administration, but Dr. Jerome Adams, who served as the U.S. Surgeon General during Donald Trump's first term, has been a vocal supporter and has urged red states to invest in them. Catherine Sweeney, WPLN News.
The trend of people moving into Tennessee appears to be slowing, yet international arrivals have been a boost to the population. This is according to the University of Tennessee researchers. They find that gains from international migrants likely hit a single-year high this year, with more than 27,000 arrivals. Tennessee's population is now at 7.2 million. UT's State Data Center says there's a nationwide slowdown of people moving. Tennessee was the 11th fastest-growing state in 2024. Nashville just had its hottest year in 2024, breaking the record set the previous year. WPLN's Caroline Eggers says the city had less flashy severe weather this past year, but there were periods of drought and extreme heat.
Nashville broke its annual heat record for the second year in a row. Now, each of the past 10 years is ranked in the city's top 20 warmest years. The warming last year was strongest in the spring and fall. Some folks thought the city felt eerie the day after the November election, when temperatures rose to 80 degrees. But last summer was also pretty hot, with some brutal heat waves. Nashville boiled at 100 degrees 3 days in a row in July, and the city hit at least 95 degrees on 36 different days, one of the highest totals in Nashville's history.
Nashville has been getting warmer and wetter on average, with more cycles of drought followed by heavy rainfall. The city is also experiencing more heat waves with temperatures over 90 degrees, as well as days with a higher heat index. Climate change, caused primarily by the burning of fossil fuels, is heating up the planet. 2024 was also Earth's hottest year on record. Jimmy Buffett's Margaritaville bar has sold for $75 million, the most a Broadway building has ever gone for. Details on the buyer are scarce thus far. The Nashville Business Journal reports it's listed as the LLC GFDDT Nashville Broadway. What is known is that the seller made quite a profit. Its prior owner bought the property in 1991 for $145,000. It is in line with other recent listings along Broadway. One building that houses a nearby saloon was listed for sale last month at close to $60 million. You'll find more news anytime at WPLN.org. Other storied recording studios offer tours, but Woodland Studios in East Nashville is a black box. Senior music writer Julie Height gained entry to find out what David Rawlings and Gillian Welch have been doing in there.
People who pay to park next to Woodland Studios may or may not realize that it belongs to roots music royalty, Gillian Welch and David Rawlings, who watched as development boomed around them and brought traffic.
Finally, we had to change it into a pay lot because we couldn't park anymore.
That's Welch. When she and Rawlings released an album named for their studio earlier this year and gave interviews, the focus was its devastation by the 2020 tornado. The thing is, that wasn't Woodland's first brush with a twister. The building became a studio in 1968. Back then, it was Woodland Sound. But a 1998 storm blew the word sound away. And even though the place operated a few more years, the perception around town that it wasn't in the best shape enabled Welch and Rawlings to buy it in 2002, as opposed to a drugstore chain, which would want to be easily spotted from the street.
And what stopped it from being snapped up immediately was that there's another building on the corner, and that blocked the visibility.
They could have gotten that corner. This would be a Walgreens.
Yes.
At the time, other musicians were building home studios. Not Welch and Rawlings. They opted for a DIY approach to outfitting what had long been a big commercial recording space for their own use.
So Dave and I, we actually did most of the work ourselves. I built this.
They called up people who could tell them how to properly construct that windowsill she's knocking on and install a patch panel in the wall where they'd plug everything in.
Dave would do the soldering, and I would kind of kneel next to him with the light.
The massive mixing console that's still in the main control room was once used on Sesame Street, and it was definitely a fixer-upper.
This board was basically empty.
It only had the components to record 2 tracks at a time.
We would go on tour and we would make money and we would save it up until we could buy another module. It was a great day when we bought the last module and we filled the board.
They were buying themselves freedom to make their albums the way they wanted.
Oh, I know that I should go.
Along with projects that Rawlings occasionally produced for others. But Rawlings says they had no intention of hiring it out for sessions.
For a lot of that time, the studios all around Nashville were closing down.
Hourly rates hadn't gone up in decades, but the costs had. And he knew they'd face the same challenges if Woodland got back into the game.
You know, a space this big with the staff that you would need.
More urgent matters have commanded Welch and Rawlings' attention. The roof was ripped right off the place in March 2020, and they dove into rescuing delicate gear. Being forced to rebuild gave them the opportunity to finally return the place to its original glory.
If you listen to the Will the Circle Be Unbroken record, which was done in the B Room in the late 60s, before
early
late
70s.
60s, early 70s, but before the carpet came in, you can hear how nice of a space it was for acoustic music.
As production trends changed, the studio got carved up into smaller spaces.
And they'd done a lot of stuff that wasn't really tied into the history of the room and wasn't really as good for what we did artistically.
Even musical touches they'd only used sparingly, like a string section. After their return to an open floor plan, the big room at Woodland could accommodate that once again.
I used to dream of something unseen.
Rawlings had his precise technical ways of testing and tuning the room's new acoustics, and Welch had hers.
Usually I just come in and kind of stomp my feet and clap a little and, I came to the place. I'll just sing a little and see what comes back, and if I feel happy singing in a room,
then it's good. In the redesigned space, Welch and Rawlings found where the sweet spot was for recording their intimately intricate folk duets. The setup they traditionally use is still arranged the way it was for this album, in a squatty T shape.
In fact, we've welded the microphone stand now to hold both of our microphones at a constant distance so that it doesn't change.
And they still use the same creaky old wooden chairs that they got from a thrift store probably 3 decades ago.
We leave them because we've been playing in these chairs. See, I know you've heard that on the records.
That subtle sound effect is another kind of record of what Gillian Welch and David Rawlings create at Woodland. Julie Height, Nashville Public Radio.
Saw a freight train yesterday. It was chugging, plugging away across the river blossom so high.
We take this look at Nashville news every weekday. If you like it, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite podcasting app and tell a friend or give us a mention on your socials. It really helps get the word out. And of course, everything at WPLN News is listener supported. You can become a member at WPLN.org. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. Let's make this day a good one, and we'll catch back up next week.